So the plot for the hero is really simple. John Kagen is a soldier in the Terran Expeditionary Force. He helps conquer a planet for the Earth Federation. He wants to retire. His officer gives him a test, which we'll talk about, and then he's crushed to death with tractor beams in a spaceship. They decide to make a hero out of him. That's it. That's the plot. Put a pin in it. Quite a bit has changed in the Thousand Worlds universe since our last episode. The Federal Empire is now in the middle of the Double War. That's also known as the Findian War, the Hrangan conflict, or the Thousand Years' War. It was a centuries-long conflict between the Federal Empire and two alien races. The Findi, which we're not going to talk about much today, and the Hrangans, which we will. Because I think the way the stories are broken up, a lot of people actually don't realize that the Hrangans are a mirror of the human Federal Empire. And that's super important to get. Basically, most of this information is only in the glossary from Dying of the Light. So the Federal Empire is the political unit that ruled human space during the early centuries of Starflight. They colonized most of the first and second generation worlds and some of the third. It's called the Federal Empire, but even the glossary calls that a misnomer. It was more correctly a democratic, socialist, cybernetic bureaucracy. That means there is a human chief administrator. That administrator is elected, and there's a legislature, and it's all a democratic process. But crucially, the day-to-day administration was conducted by artificial intelligences. The only conclusion that we can draw is that these artificial intelligences were running the war, telling the Empire where to send troops, what planets to hold, what planets to invade, when to retreat, where to send their supplies. Keep in mind that even though there is faster than light travel, communications are not instantaneous. And my estimate is the human empire is a couple hundred light years across. So those delays would be significant. And while AI administration might be more efficient, it does not work out any better for the Empire than it did for the crew of the Electo in Warship. So essentially, Earth is run by a technocratic bureaucracy, Elon Musk types, and there are dissidents, but Earth is able to maintain its social order by sending those dissidents, incorrigibles, as the glossary calls them, to heavy gravity planets named Rommel and Wellington. Over generations, the populations of those planets adapt to heavy gravity, and they are rebranded as the War Worlds because that's where the Terran Empire draws its military forces from. It's pretty clear that over hundreds of years, the human administrators of Earth simply got bored with the war and grew decadent, like we see on Prometheus in the story Star Lady. And the AI just kept giving orders to the military. Get troops from here, send troops here, build more ships, and the war just kept grinding on, and the human military commanders seem to have grown increasingly frustrated with the detached command from Earth. And finally, they revolt. They can do this because, ironically, even though Earth is still being administered by AI, they have discontinued the practice on starships following the Electo and Golem incidents. In any case, at some point, the Federal Empire tried to remove Stephen Cobalt Northstar from his position as commander of the 13th Fleet, and he responded by destroying the planet of Wellington. That and the revolt of Thor are considered to be the start of the collapse. Somewhere around this point in the timeline, the Federal Empire attempted to recall most of their fleets to defend Earth space, and the 17th Fleet, which was based around Avalon and commanded by Regine Tober, also rebels. Tober would take his fleet and found his own little personal empire on a planet called Tober in the Veil. It's interesting to speculate if there might have been some sort of secret that came to light that caused so many of these commanders to rebel at the same time, or if they just saw their opportunity and took it. But the destruction of Wellington and the loss of so many ships really seem to have spelled the end of their military power. And all but the most advanced planets in the galaxy enter what's known as the interregnum. That is at least a generation of the loss of starflight, where many planets revert to primitive states. But we'll talk more about that in later episodes. The story we're talking about this week, The Hero, takes place 30 years into the Double War, and it is set on the Hrangan front. The story follows Kagen, a Wellington-born heavy-gravity soldier in the Terran Expeditionary Force. Kagen is separated from the rest of his force with his hip rockets and helmet disabled. I think the opening lines illustrate pretty clearly the tone of this short story. It had been a long time dying. Resistance had lasted almost a week, and the fighting had been bitter for a while. But in the end, the invaders had broken past the defenders, as they had broken so many others in the past. The alien sky with its double sun did not bother them. They had fought and won under skies of azure blue and speckled gold and inky black. The weather control boys had hit first, while the main force was still hundreds of miles to the east. Storm after storm had flailed at the streets of the city to slow the defensive preparations and smash the spirit of resistance. When they were closer, the invaders had sent up howlers. Unending high-pitched shrieks had echoed back and forth, both day and night, and before long, most of the populace had fled in demoralized panic. By then, the attackers' main force was in range and launched plague bombs on a steady westward wind. Even then, the natives had tried to fight back. From their defensive emplacements ringing the city, the survivors had sent up a hail of atomics, managing to vaporize one whole company whose defensive screens were overloaded by the sudden assault. But the gesture was a feeble one at best. By that time, the incendiary bombs were raining down steadily upon the city, and great clouds of acid gas were blowing across the plains. And behind the gas, the dreaded assault squads of the Terran Expeditionary Force moved on the last defenses. Kagen scowled at the dented plastoid helmet at his feet and cursed his luck. A routine mopping up detail, he thought. Then, thanks to his synthestim and reaction training, he slaughters 5 natives, some of whom attempt to surrender, on his way back to camp. When he makes it back, he meets Rigeli, his fellow soldier, who is wearing heavy duralloy armor, which Kagen says is for defense, but Kagen is wearing light plastoid armor, which I guess makes it easier to fly around with his hip rockets on assault missions. In what seems to be an unusual or even unprecedented request, Kagen wants to retire to Earth. For the duration of his meeting with his commanding officer, Grady, he is restrained with tractor beams. On the officer's desk is an antique laser from Earth that one of Grady's ancestors used in the fire wars of the early 21st century. In another one of George R. Martin's stories, Dark, Dark Were the Tunnels, a sort of primitive human named Greel encounters more advanced humans from the moon, which was not destroyed in the nuclear war that seems to have taken place on Earth. In any case, when he sees them, he thinks, legends said the old ones had fought with fire and stranger weapons. So I wonder if maybe that nuclear war that destroyed Earth was the Fire Wars? There's actually enough time in the timeline that Earth could have suffered a nuclear holocaust and been recolonized by humans from the moon before any of these stories take place. The fallen humans living in the tunnels also developed psychic abilities, so that could be the genesis of the psionic and psychic talents of characters in the Thousand Worlds stories. It could even explain the lost colony of Lethaland and the Gethsoids of Oth. But maybe we'll talk about that later. I don't think I've heard anyone else put forth this theory. I don't know. Leave a comment if you think it's possible or not. When Kagen is asked why he wants to retire, he seems to be motivated by a desire for celebrity, wanting to be the, quote, fastest, strongest guy on a low-gravity world. I feel like it's important to note here that Kagen, who is a man who must be in his 30s at the earliest, is acting like a teenager. So obviously he's not a great person, but if we want to know why, I think we can just state that his actions are characterized by an absence of thought or ethical deliberation. When he kills the 5 natives in the beginning of the story, quote, he did not pause. Kagen did not hesitate. Kagen did not think. Kagen killed. So he's actually been programmed to have certain physical responses in his reaction training. Even his commander doesn't think of him as a person with wants and desires and a full human being, but as a specimen whose psych training and combat conditioning make him unfit for civilian life. That's the most charitable explanation anyway. But I think we should also consider that he is addicted to synthestem. Not only does this surely have negative effects on his personality, it also makes it more or less impossible for the soldiers to rebel. The military supplies them with synthestem and also appears to turn a blind eye when they take more than their prescribed dose. I would argue it's intentional. Major Grady attempts to convince Kagen not to retire to Earth, but winds up giving him a test when he decides to reach for that antique laser pistol. Kagan's conditioning takes over, and he lunges at Grady, but is stopped by the tractor beams. One of Kagan's excuses for why he wanted to retire was that he wasn't feeling as fast as he was used to. So Grady plays off this as a test of his reaction speed. But clearly it's a test to see if Kagan could actually live with people who are not reaction trained. And Kagan fails. When he insists on his retirement, Grady pretends to resign himself to allowing it, but secretly plans his execution. So they put together a little ceremony for him as he boards a shuttle to take him to the ship that will presumably take him to Earth. They use tractor beams to hold him onto a crash couch while he is lifted into orbit, but the beams are never turned off and, in fact, only increase in intensity despite his complaints, eventually killing him by crushing his bones and driving his war metal through his heart. Most of the commentary I was able to find about this story talks about this. I don't think it's very subtle or even particularly interesting, but I am impressed with how Martin creates empathy for a character that is awful. The story concludes with Grady ordering Kagan's body to be spaced like any other broken piece of equipment. Finally, he instructs his aide to spin up a press report titled "War Hero Dies When Hrangans Blast Ship" for a little bit of publicity for the networks back on Earth. Kagan's medals are sent back to his homeworld barracks museum, completing his transformation into a hero, at least as far as the propaganda is concerned. I want to dwell on just a few more elements of the Federal Empire. So when Kagan is speaking with Grady, Grady gives a speech to try to motivate Kagan by explaining that the war is about to get interesting. Here's what he says. "We've been at war with the Hrangans Empire for nearly 3 decades now. Direct clashes between us and the enemy have been few and far between up to now. Each of us has been struggling to consolidate his position by grabbing these little worlds in border regions, these mudholes, as you call them. But they're very important mudholes. We need them for bases, for their raw materials, for their industrial capacity, and for the conscript labor they provide. That's why we try to minimize damage in our campaigns. And that's why we use psych war tactics like the Howlers to frighten away as many natives as possible before each attack. to preserve labor. I also want to talk a bit about Prometheus because the humans have more than just heavy gravity soldiers. There's a bunch of other genetically modified humans as well. So Prometheus was the headquarters of the Ecological Warfare Corps, also called the EEC, or Earth Ecological Engineering Corps. So this was the headquarters for the biowarships like the Ark, seen in the Tough Voyaging stories. They would genetically engineer diseases, insects, and plant and animal pests to wreak havoc on Hrangan worlds that they didn't want to occupy directly. But maybe most importantly, Prometheus was also responsible for the altered men. In Dying of the Light, Garce Janicek says this about altered men. They have manipulated their own genes to such a degree that they have lost the right to call themselves men at all, in my opinion. Dragonfly men, undersea men, men who breathe poison, men who see in the dark like the Hrun, men with 4 arms, hermaphrodites, soldiers without stomachs, breeding sows without sentience. These creatures are not men. So that's about it for the humans, but what about the Hrangans? The glossary from Dying of the Light defines Hrangans like this. Humanity's great enemy during the Double War. The Hrangans were perhaps the most alien sentients ever encountered. Their social system was structured on the basis of a number of different biological castes, most of whom seemed to belong to different species, so different were they. Of the Hrangan millions, only the so-called minds were truly intelligent, and mankind never communicated successfully with them. The Hrangans were bitterly xenophobic. Prior to the Double War, they had enslaved a dozen less advanced races, and there is evidence that they had exterminated others entirely. The war effectively destroyed the Hrangans, except on Old Hranga itself and a handful of their oldest colonies. There's one more passage I want to look at from Dying of the Light, and this is going to save us time later because that's a novel, and I'm kind of dreading covering that here, to be honest. It'll be several episodes. But the passage that interests me is a character by the name of Jan Vickery is talking about his planet, High Cavalon's time under Hrangan assault, occupation, I don't know. I looked upon illustrations of the various semi-sentient races the Hrangans used as shock troops on worlds they did not deem worthy of their own immediate attention. The nocturnal Hrun, heavy gravity warriors of immense strength and savagery, who see well in the infrared. Winged dactyloids, who got their name from some chance resemblance to a beast of human prehistory. Worst of all, the Githyanki, the soul sucks with their terrible psionic powers. Consider its truth. The colony Kavana, that's the original name of Kavalar, stands, with its cities on the plains and its far-flung mining operations. The Hrangans level the cities with a nuclear bombardment. Survivors live only in the deep shelters and out in the wild in the mines. To make the planet their own, the Hrangans also land contingents of their slave races. Then they depart, not to return for a century. The mines become their first holdfasts. Others are built later, carved deep into stone. Their cities gone, the miners revert to a more primitive level of technology and soon establish a rigid, survival-oriented culture. For endless generations, they war against the slave races and against each other. According to his hypothesis, the Hrangans had returned to High Cavalon approximately a century after their first raid. The cities they had bombed were still slag. There was no sign of new building on the part of the humans. Yet the 3 slave races they had dropped to seed the planet were nowhere in evidence. Decimated. Extinct. Undoubtedly, the Hrangan mind commanding concluded that some of the humans still lived. To effect a final wiping up, the Hrangans dropped plague bombs. James Lyon's poems had no mention of Hrangans, but many mentions of sickness. All the surviving Kavalar accounts agreed on that. There was a sorrowing plague, a long period where one horrible epidemic after another swept through the holdfasts. Each turn of the season brought a new and more dreadful disease. the ultimate demon enemy, one the Cavalars could not fight or kill. 90 men died out of every 100. 90 men and 99 women. All of this is to say that the Hrangan approach to conquering a planet is quite similar to the human one. They open up with some sort of salvo to cause psychological damage. In the humans' case, they use weather-based attacks and incendiary bombs, while it seems the Hrangans use nuclear weapons. If that first attack doesn't work, then the humans will move on to using their light armored flying troops, whereas the Hrangans would use their lightly equipped dactyloids, which fly like pterodactyls. The humans have their howlers, and I don't see a direct equivalent for the dactyloids, but I don't know that that's a problem because the Hrangans also have Githyanki, who use psychic psionic attacks. We'll talk about the Githyanki a lot more another time. I will point out that the humans also have psych troops in the form of genetically modified and specially trained cats. If that doesn't work, both sides move on to their heavy gravity adapted night assault troops, the Haroon for the Hrangans and the Wellington and Rommel Warworlders for the humans. Next, both sides will use plague bombs if their initial assaults don't subdue the planet. Both sides use the natives of the worlds they conquer, either as slave races or conscript slave labor. I mean, you don't think the human empire is paying these conscripts, do you? The Hrangan Empire is administered by Hrangan mines, which only survive on Old Hranka and their earliest colonies. And the human empire was administered by artificial intelligences, which now exist only on Old Earth, or maybe their earliest colonies. Both sides seem to have a technological parity, and they have both settled the Jambles. During the interregnum, it seems both sides resort to cannibalism. We get a mention of ritual Hrangan cannibalism in A Song for Leah. And in Dying of the Light, we learn about the deep coal dwellings of the Kavalar people who resort to cannibalism as well. And the last thing that I want to point out, which might seem a little silly, is that we know Hrangans also live in houses with walls that meet at right angles, thanks to the Stone City. Having read these stories as much as I have, I'm actually pretty convinced that the Hrangans are actually humans. At no point in any of these stories do we get a physical description of a Hrangan. I wonder, and we'll get into this in our episode on Dying of the Light, I actually wonder or suspect that the Hrangans and humans may have interbred on that planet. We're almost done, but there's a little etymology to discuss. The protagonist, John Kagen, I think it probably comes from the Irish Mac Kagen, meaning son of fire. Also, note that the name Egan is basically derived from that as well. Grady is also an Irish surname, meaning noble. So I assume here that's used ironically. Once again, I find this essay went on for much longer than I intended. I'm glad you stuck around. I think that this story is quite decent. Definitely not one of my favorites. Thanks again for sticking around. If you enjoyed this, then please like and subscribe. I got way more views on my last video than I did on my first, and I'm hoping to continue that trend. Next week, we talk about the men of Greywater Station and the Findi.